The Fact Check podcast is hosted by 3 rehab professionals with decades of combined experience. But I'm not one of them. I'm just making this intro. If you are finding the world of health and musculoskeletal care confusing and contradicting, and let's be honest, at times a bit crazy, our efforts here are aimed against all that misinformation through real research and real evidence. Let's do this, people. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be considered medical advice.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Fact Check podcast. I'm your host, Alexis Léveillé. I'm a physical therapist down in Montreal, and I do international consults. Today, I'm joined by Diego.
Hello guys, I'm Diego Hidalgo. You may know me as Skeptical Physio, and I'm also a physical therapist now living in Madrid.
And today we're joined by, I think, someone that's going to be like my favorite guest. We talk all the time. Whenever I have a question about something I'm too dumb to understand, she's my go-to. And often she's actually already wrote about it. It's kind of intimidating. Sometimes people ask me how I juggle like my Instagram page, which is mostly shitposts and science, and like working full-time. And for her, I actually don't know, because it's so much work and it's just serious work. I can at least make some jokes when I'm tired, but for her, it's just serious. So we have Andrea Love today, Dr. Andrea Love, actually. And I feel like she'll introduce her title because she's got a bunch. And
Yeah,
welcome to the
thanks
show.
for having me. Thank you. I'm a immunologist and microbiologist, research scientist. I'm a biomedical scientist. I work full-time in life sciences biotech. And like many of us, do SciComm as a volunteer because there is way too much health misinformation out there, and it is being amplified by media outlets, by influencers, by very wealthy podcasters. And I felt a sense of responsibility to try to combat it.
Yeah. So to give everyone a little purview of why we invited Andrea, I think she would be perfect because there's a lot of rumbling going on in like right now in politics regarding the Make America Healthy Again movement. They did a conference, I did a bunch of posts about it, actually some with Andrea, and we didn't feel qualified to tackle that on our own. So she's going to help us with that today. We're also going to have a little bit of a go at Guberman's recent, like further deep dive into misinformation is what I would call it. Or grifting rather. And I think a lot of it is going to focus on RFK, and we're going to also address some of the tangential questions that they're posing, like a little bit on the means, the brother and sister, and basically the other stuff. I don't think we're going to touch too much on Food Babe because I think we've made it pretty obvious that she's not qualified, and you've got plenty of stuff on it already. All right, so Diego, I think you should start with your first question, if you think that's a good idea too.
Sure. So I believe that due to the, let's say, recent events like the Trump election, the USA election, I would like to ask you how much can be legally done during the Trump administration when it comes to health regulations, assuming it's going to last only 4 years.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, it really goes to the fact that most Americans don't actually understand how our government operates. They don't realize the different arms of government and how they interplay with each other and how, budgets are shaped. But, there could be quite a bit of damage, especially the Congress races haven't been fully called, and that's going to relate to the federal Senate and the federal House of Representatives. Little schoolhouse rock, you've got the judicial branch, you got the executive branch, you got the legislative branch. So the president is in charge of the executive branch, which means that he can appoint all of the heads of departments and heads of executive offices. So Health and Human Safety, NIH, CDC, FDA, EPA, USDA. All of these are federal regulatory and safety agencies. And so because the director of those is appointed by the executive branch, he can certainly undermine them by putting in people that don't actually know science, don't align with science, don't actually have expertise in any of those fields that those agencies are headed, are responsible for. So that's really concerning. Depending on what happens with the House in Congress, so the legislative branch really assigns budgets for all of these different federal agencies and departments. So there's different processes, but usually the Senate and the House have to kind of pass and kind of compromise and come to an agreement, which then goes to the president to sign off on. And as of right now, we don't know what the House is going to be, who's going to control that. But we know the Senate is now under GOP control. That's Grand Old Party. It's the Republican Party. If the House is controlled by them as well, that means that the Trump administration or the Republican Party that's in the U.S. would have control of all arms of the federal government, which means that they can essentially decide budget and they could defund all of these agencies theoretically. So it could be really, really bad. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of manipulation in terms of how judicial appointments are made. And so these are our justices, and those are for lower courts as well as all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so laws that are challenged or policies that are challenged, if they have a favorable judicial appointment, they can basically do whatever they want. There really isn't a lot of guardrails if someone has the trifecta.
So can I ask you, let's say, can you imagine the worst scenario? What could you predict?
Yes. I mean, I try not to because I am still trying to sleep. No, it's fine. I mean, you could essentially, I wrote about some of what he did in his previous administration where he gutted the budgets for the USDA and the FDA. And so the USDA and the FDA are in charge of a lot of our food safety authority, food safety oversight, food regulations. They also obviously conduct a lot of research, right? Because we like to vilify the government, but the governmental agencies have a lot of really incredible scientists that work for them, and they're not governmental appointments. They're scientists that happen to be working in a governmental research entity. So during his last administration, he cut the budget from the FDA. So the FDA oversees about 80% of food supply. So that is safety and regulation of processed food. So anything that has food additives, mixed ingredients. They also oversee produce items. They oversee the safety of seafood. They also enforce the Food Safety Modernization Act, which actually was implemented in 2011, which allowed us to tackle preventing foodborne illness, so preventing contamination in food products as opposed to just dealing with outbreaks of foodborne illness when they happen. And that includes regulations and standards for how foods are packaged, how foods are processed, how foods are actually produced from the raw materials, whether we're talking about vegetable crops or animal products. And it also expanded their authority to mandate recalls of contaminated foods and expanded their ability to inspect food production facilities, both here and internationally, because we import foods too, right? And so, that's a huge thing that contributes to the health and safety of our food supply. The USDA, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they do that for meat, poultry, and egg products. And that's through the Food Safety and Inspection Service, the FSIS. And so they do inspections of slaughterhouses, processing facilities, anyone that's butchering meat or poultry, any imports of those. And they also enforce hygiene and all of these food recalls associated with those products. And so during his last administration, he wanted to cut the budget by 31%. There was some pushback by Congress, but they did cut the budget by 8%, which was about $83 million. And for context, the defense budget in the U.S. is orders of magnitude more than what these food safety budgets get. But as a result, that meant that we lost scientists, personnel that were supposed to be conducting food safety inspections. So inspections dropped by 33%, meaning that we don't have the resources to ensure that food production facilities are keeping up with food safety regulations. State level inspections also dropped because the FDA contracts those out. And the USDA budget was cut 19%. That was $4.8 billion. And a big chunk of that was for agricultural research, which relates to both modern agriculture, science, but also projects related to foodborne illness. And he also uncapped how quickly pork processing facilities can process pigs. So basically, speeds are created to keep food contamination safety in mind. And so previously regulations were facilities could process 1,106 hogs per hour, but Trump implemented a law, the 2019 USDA new swine inspection system, which removed any regulatory cap on that, which means these facilities can just process as many hogs as possible, as much as they can, and that obviously you can imagine there's a lot of opportunities for contamination. And when we talk about foodborne illness, a lot of these things, these pathogens, Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, these are bacteria that live everywhere on our planet, in the soil, in the water, in food, in the guts of animals. And the reason that they end up in food products is because of, contamination, sloppy processing, not washing, disinfecting, sanitizing appropriately. And so if you remove a lot of those checkpoints to ensure food safety, then you're going to likely see an increase in food contamination and foodborne illness. And so it's really problematic. And that's only two departments, right? He also relocated the Economic Research Service, which used to be housed in DC. He moved it to Kansas City, and it was all this, oh, well, I want to be closer to where the farming is happening. But it actually was to cut costs. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of families that worked, scientists that worked there. They couldn't up and move from DC to Kansas City. And so they lost 60% of their personnel in 2019 when it was relocated. And so now you have essentially an entirely vacant department. And a lot of people are like, well, couldn't Biden, correct for some of this? And the answer is yes, but you can't restaff an entire department as quickly as you can gut it. And Congress is still partially controlled by Republicans, and they don't want regulatory oversight, even though we have data that regulatory oversight is what keeps us safe. And then of course you have CDC, you have NIH. I mean, they could defund not only NIH, but any academic research that is being funded by government granting. So, it wouldn't impact even just biomedical science. It could impact climate science. It could impact really a myriad of everything. And it's really problematic. I mean, I think you could kind of envision your worst nightmare with regard to pretty much any health and science topic, and those could be realities.
Yeah. Fact.
For me, I was flashing the people that Trump appointed, both now and in the past, and he's like, for immigration, I was a white nationalist. For the EPA, was a coal lobbyist. I think he also named an oil lobbyist at some point. And then his new, I think his chief of staff, the woman he just announced was going to be his chief of staff, she has a long history of corporate lobbyist activity, including for, big food, and this whole kind of MAHA movement. They're just publicly targeting a single company, Kellogg's, and claiming that is the solution to human health. And we know, every time I kind of try to have this conversation, people are like, well, you're just making guesses. And I'm like, no, like, these people have been in power. We have evidence from Trump's previous administration. We have evidence from RFK Jr.'s 40 years of activism. I mean, these are not hypothetical things. These are things that they have already done, and obviously have not done a 180 all of a sudden, and they will continue to do, because that's what the evidence says. Yeah. Yeah, so that's the thing. Well, I find it really, really interesting that a lot of people are convinced that the anti-regulation party is the one that's going to make, food more safe or more regulated. It's kind of a conundrum. Like, they're anti-big government.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you think regulations are? You can't just make rules. You need people to enforce the rules. And
right. And they're they're currently targeting a non-governmental company. I said private company. It's a publicly traded company, but it's a non-governmental company, right? And they're saying, well, it's Kellogg's. Kellogg's is poisoning people. And first of all, Kellogg's is adhering to all of the food safety guidelines that have been developed by governmental agencies globally. And all of those governmental safety agencies are staffed with expert scientists that actually know how to understand toxicological data, and they've set safety thresholds for all of these substances and ingredients that these people are screaming about. And the ingredients are not banned in other countries. So, it's you want to target a non-governmental company, claim that they're poisoning people, but they're actually adhering to all of the safety benchmarks that have been set in motion because of science. So if you want to deregulate all of the food safety agencies, then it's really going to be the Wild West. And, and of course we're seeing, they don't want milk safety. They don't want, consumer protections for a variety of things. And it's, very bizarre as a scientist when you try to do a simple fact check and literally just saying, no, this is actually the law in another country, is you're bought and paid for, when the people that are spreading the misinformation have really obvious financial motives.
Yeah. And to the people that are listening to this, might be more like central than we are, I guess. The way I structured this is I looked at, as a non-specialist, I looked at all the data that could support your point, and I know Andrea's answers for them. So there's even a point where I think we're going to be stumped and we're going to be like, yeah, this just warrants more data. It's about raw milk and its potential benefits. I was really surprised. I think it's bullshit, but whatever. I looked at the data for you because I know people that criticize me. They say, do your own research. I did it. I do my research all the time. So let's get into it. I think we should start just tackling like RFK specific claims. I think the biggest one, the one that has most traction right now, is fluoride. So I'll just pull up his specific tweet. Where is it? Hang on. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So I'm gonna share this tab. Okay, there it is. So, Robert Kennedy Jr. FDA's war on public health is about to end. This included its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamins, clear foods, sunshine, exercise, nutraceuticals, and anything else that advances human health and can be patented by pharma. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have two messages for you. One, preserve your records, and two, pack your bags. Wow. Okay. Tots.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of word salad that really hits all of the buzzwords of the current wellness industry.
Yeah.
I will say at a very broad level, there's no active, aggressive suppression of anything, right? If there's evidence for things for therapeutic benefit, they can be submitted using various channels depending on what we're talking about. So there's BLA path, there's IND path, and those can be reviewed by scientific experts to see if there's a therapeutic benefit that outweighs the risk of the thing. It's interesting that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are FDA approved and regulated. They just don't do anything for viral infections. Ivermectin is utilized for various parasitic infections like strongyloides. It's very effective for that. And hydroxychloroquine is an antiparasitic that can be used for certain types of malaria and other parasites. they just don't work on COVID because it's a viral infection. So really weird that got thrown in there. But of course, you know, he doesn't really understand how science works. Raw milk. We used to have raw milk. We used to have the Wild West of milk, and the safety agencies implemented the pasteurized milk ordinance, and that was implemented in the 1920s because we were seeing tons of foodborne illness because of raw milk. And so we're not suppressing anything aside from foodborne illness in that context. When we're talking about other things like stem cells, so there's a science-based way that stem cells are being studied and utilized for various cell and gene therapies. But he's utilizing this in the way of these med spa clinics who claim that, you know, stem cell transfusions are going to cure all these myriad of ailments. And there's no evidence for that. And there's a lot of potential harm. And the same is true for all of these other things like hyperbaric therapy, chelating compounds. So chelation is used if someone has acute toxicity and they need something to bind whatever that toxin happens to be and help remove it more quickly from the body. But in the wellness industry, chelating compounds are touted to cure everything from leaky gut to toxic mold to chronic Lyme to hormone issues. And again, these are people that are selling these as part of that unregulated supplement industry. And ironically, like, nobody is suppressing sunshine and exercise, or I don't know, clear foods, broth, water. I don't know. But
are you sure,
you know,
in Canada, if you go outside and it's sunny, they shoot you?
oh wow, that's
Yeah,
wild.
it's a
Wild.
communist hellhole. Yeah.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about how to support your immune system because, you know, the phrase immune boosting is really, it's been a buzzword forever. And regular moderate exercise is something that is always included in there. I actually got told recently that only conservatives were athletes, and I was like, that's so weird because I have a black belt in judo and run marathons and ultra marathons, so I guess what does that make me? But yeah, nobody's suppressing exercise, nobody's suppressing sunshine. We're saying you need to be exposed to sunshine in a responsible way because excess ultraviolet radiation is a direct cause of skin cancer. But what he's basically saying is he's creating this both sidesism, suggesting that government is trying to keep people sick, which is that consistent line of the wellness industry. And he's eroding confidence in all of these safety agencies that actually do review data and approve things that have evidence. And while undermining it, then promoting all of the things that he and his friends make a lot of money selling.
Yeah. Yeah, the sunshine argument is just so funny. I suggest we go like bit by bit. So if we go, let's start with like, we can do these quickly. It's so easy. So ivermectin, most recent meta-analysis is the 2024 one by Zilong Song, ivermectin for treatment of COVID-19, a systematic review and meta-analysis. 33 randomized control trials involving over 10,000 people, and there was no significant effect on mortality. They did show a small difference in mechanical ventilation requirement. So they say 33% difference. But then they conducted a sensitivity analysis. And when you exclude the small studies with sample size that are biased to show an effect, they found significant effect modification of motor mechanical ventilation requirement. And I've done a lot of review on this. You can see the same for, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we talk about myocarditis risks for the COVID vaccine, there's a lot here. What's interesting, there's no clear publication bias, but for myocarditis, there's a huge publication bias, and it's probably because it was trending. So publications were like, yeah, oh, you have an effect on myocarditis, we'll print that. This is going to make the rounds. Like these, you know, conspiracy theories are going to love this and they're going to cite it all over.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of these, especially the small studies, you know, they're often, you know, many of those were conducted early on in the pandemic, where you're essentially throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, and so there's a lot of confounding variables in these, you know, but yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no there's no clinical evidence that ivermectin is beneficial for COVID or other viral infections. As I mentioned, ivermectin is FDA approved for very specific things. There are human formulations that are approved for parasitic worms and also for topical things like head lice infestation and certain skin conditions. But again, not for viruses. So like, I don't know why he's fixating on that, because go get a parasitic infection. You could take some ivermectin if you really want to take some ivermectin. But it's this weird, well, if the government or actual credible scientists tell you it doesn't work, then you're going to kind of have this knee-jerk reaction and say, well, we're just gonna cherry pick until we find something that says it does work, even if there's nothing there. And even things that are FDA approved can have adverse effects, right? Nothing is without risk. Walking across the street is not without risk. And so ivermectin, if you're not taking it for a real medical need, it can interact with blood thinners. You can obviously overdose on it just like you can with anything. And it can cause GI symptoms in particular. And that's particularly true if you're taking non-human formulations like those you might find at an agricultural supply store for animals, which people were doing during the pandemic as well.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting is that these people that are always saying the publication, like the scientific process is biased and all that, is that we can look at these papers and say, here, there's a clear example of bias. So for this paper, I understand why people could latch onto it. If you look at the earlier 2022 paper, it did show, I'd say, promising results. But if you can't analyze the data, I'm not pretending I'm a methodologist or anything, but even I can see this, and I only have like a master's in science. And for instance, they did a funnel plot. Like, look, this is so suspicious. They did a funnel plot, which a funnel plot, if people are not familiar, you plot all the studies around usually the biggest effect size of the largest study, because that's usually the one that's going to be the most representative. And you see where the studies fall. Usually it should follow a normal distribution that looks like a funnel. And then visually you can assess, oh, clearly there's some small studies missing or some big positive studies missing. That's how we can ascertain stuff like the drawer effect or the publication bias. Because to summarize really quickly, and correct me if I'm wrong, like in general, is that small studies are usually easier to keep in the drawer because there's not a lot of money invested. So you don't need to publish it. It's like, oh, we'll just try again until we get the result we want. With a very large study, if you got like millions of people, that's a lot of money to throw in the trash. So generally, larger study are more reliable. So yeah, that's what they did. And the funnel plot, they did it, the one that there was no effect for mortality. They did a funnel plot for the other things, for adverse events and mechanical ventilation, which again, the sensitivity analysis showed that the effect kind of went away. They didn't draw a funnel plot. So my impression is that there's probably, why are they so lazy that they won't do that? Like you just plug the data. It's pretty quick to do, right? It's probably because they noticed that there was a significant publication bias. Yeah, usually, right? It wouldn't take that long to do that, right?
Yeah, especially if you're already implementing it for your other data outcome. So usually if there's like an obvious gap in a data set or a method, that would be pretty obvious. And that's really why, I often say that even if you're a scientist in one field, it doesn't automatically mean you can go and interpret the accuracy or the appropriateness of a study in another field, because if you don't know that a certain culture model or research model is relevant, you can't make any interpretations from the data.
Yeah. They also didn't even run like an Eggers regression. So I'm really nerding out here, but like in general, funnel plot is just a visual assessment. So you can make a qualitative judgment on whether something is publication biased or not. And Eggers gives you a number. I couldn't explain the statistic behind it. I don't know how to do it. I just know how to interpret it. And they just didn't do that. And when you have the data set, I've worked on studies. It's quite easy to just, you ask the statisticians to do that. It's not really long, as far as I know. So yeah, that's for ivermectin. I feel like we could move on to the other point. So hydroxychloroquine, I don't have data on it, but I think you've covered it. That one, I think, actually increases risk as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these antiparasitics. So antiparasitics, they target eukaryotic organisms that can cause illness in us. And just like Human cells, eukaryotic parasites, have similar but not identical structure and function. So they share a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles. And so typically when you're taking an anti-parasitic, people broadly are more likely to have adverse effects because there are some shared mechanisms from different species of eukaryotes versus an antiviral or an antibiotic where they're targeting completely different organisms that we don't share really any sort of similarity in our cell structure. And so, yeah, I mean, you're not going to take an anti-malarial just for fun. So, and you know, it's all of these, including all of your dietary supplements for COVID, vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D, all of these things have really been extensively studied to the point of like wastefulness of research dollars and time. And it's, you know, certainly frustrating that we're still harping on that.
Yeah. There's a meta-analysis from Lucetta from 2023, which is on my screen right now. Essentially, there's no evidence that hydroxychloroquine is good. And I've seen other papers showing it increases the risk of adverse events. Because again, there's side effects. So again, I kind of have more empathy for this one because that during a lot of people know this. I started my page during COVID and because I was tired of all the misinformation. And I could see all the people that I know that are not like conspiracy theorists or anything. They just see that on TV and they have no idea how to read a paper.
Sure. Yeah.
And there was a lot of misleading research. And that's an example of both the media and the publication system kind of working in cahoots to push a narrative. I mean,
academic publication nowadays is really problematic. You have so many pay to publish predatory journals. You have journals who are bringing in peer reviewers who don't have expertise in the field, so they're not even equipped to adequately review them, and so things are getting by editorial that shouldn't be published. And then academic institutes are writing press releases to get attention for their researchers and get funding and donations, and then those are picked up by media outlets, and it's this vicious cycle of really just like amplifying this health anxiety and this fear mongering, which, you know, accelerated during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but we could have, and by we, I mean a lot of these people who were bad actors during the pandemic could have done so much good in alleviating this and providing nuance and providing real information, and instead went the route of how much can we profit off of scaring people needlessly.
Yeah. I will say a lot of people will hear that and say, well, we should just throw science out. The point is just that science is not sciencey enough. The alternative is even worse. There's no oversight whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
So, right.
I mean, we need a huge overhaul of how academic research is published, but there's also a lot of places where you don't automatically need to publish, right? A lot of people are publishing in journals because they work at an academic institute and their funding is dependent on getting a grant. And in order to apply for grants, they have to show that they've published some research in progress. But if you're working in non-academic industries, you don't necessarily need to publish every single time you make a very incremental positive or negative finding. You only need to publish when it's something really impactful that the scientific community needs to know about. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about, you know, publication history and number of publications and the type of journal and so on. But yeah, we need a huge overhaul. We need to change the incentives for why people publish things. And obviously that's not a solution, but that's why it's really important that you don't just read an abstract or read a title or assume because you can find it on PubMed, it's automatically good, because that is not the case. And that's why people are trained in how to dissect these things and assess whether or not the data even support what the abstract is saying, which frequently it doesn't, because the abstract is an advertisement for the paper to get people to read it, to get people to click on it. And often it is inflating what the data say.
Yeah. I'll let Diego speak after this, but essentially can I go? I just want to finish on this.
Now that we're talking about this, I would like you to ask the question that how do you think that science communicators can fight in equal terms when it comes to this, let's say, misinformation accounts like Léveillé or Huberman, if you want to, or Trump. I mean, it seems, because we have this, I think, this conversation many times. Yeah, we can try to communicate science in in more interesting ways or in more accurate ways, but somehow, I don't know if it's the algorithm or how people want the content. It seems that these misinformation pages are always like 2 or 3 steps above or beyond us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing people need to realize is that a lot of those accounts and pages, that's their full-time job. Their full-time job is creating content that they can spread online. They have a lot of money behind it through advertisements, through sponsors, through paid subscribers, through, different channels to fund that. And that's why it's their full-time, well, that's partly why it's their full-time job. And so they have reach and resources and production and a team and PR people and media connections and all the things to give them visibility and create this perception that notoriety is expertise. Whereas most of us who are doing the fact checking and the debunking, we're doing it because our full-time job is in science and health, and we do it in this game of whack-a-mole, duct taped together in our free time when we have energy. We're not getting paid for it, and oftentimes we're losing money on it because we're not getting paid for it, but we're trying to compete by buying home recording equipment and writing materials. So, that's the first thing, is that we're not on a level playing field because, people with a moral compass and people with scruples are not going to take sponsorship dollars from wellness companies that are actively undermining health. Whereas those other people, it's a $5.6 trillion industry. It is insanely lucrative because there are no checkpoints, no guardrails, no oversight, no data required. It's pure profit and really no science. And then on top of that, you have the fact that false information that elicits negative emotions, fear, anxiety, worry, spreads faster than real information. And so these people can make these all or nothing, really clickbait statements, and that's going to go viral before well, no, actually, the nuance is not quite what that says. And then you have a lot of these social media companies that actually kind of create an algorithm that's going to, fabricate this rabbit hole. So if you view something like that, it's going to feed you and force you to view more of that content, more radical content, more unsubstantiated content, more accounts like that content. And so it's really, really a multifactorial issue. And, reality is not sensational or not sexy. It's like, well, you need to do fundamentals for optimal health, and it's XYZ. And people, they want to hear the quick fixes because that reality, that fabricated reality, that desire is appealing. Because if you feel like you can hack your health and take control of everything, then you don't have to come to terms with the fact that, everybody dies of something. And if you live long enough, you're inevitably going to get a disease of aging, a cancer, a neurodegenerative disease, something like that, because, your organs, your cells, your tissues, they can only hold out for so long.
Of course, and I think that we all agree that there are health issues, but in this sense, it seems like there are two, let's say, distant parties when it comes to how to solve such health issues. So now that we are going to start talking about Robert Kennedy, I would like to ask you, what things do you agree about when it comes to, let's say, how can both sides agree about something, about these health topics, if you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I will start by saying that he's created a lot of the health issues that we have now over his 40-year history of eroding science and trust in science. I will say that we need more people eating a diverse diet. I don't really hear him talk a lot about that. He likes to talk about how we're the sickest we've ever been and we're riddled with chronic illness. I wouldn't say that we're riddled with chronic illness, but I would say if you look at cause of death in humans nowadays, at least in developed nations, people are dying of chronic illness. And the reason for that is because we're not dying of acute illnesses anymore because of things like vaccines. So, you know, there are different health challenges, you know, instead of infection, trauma, communicable diseases, foodborne illness, we're now coping with heart disease, cancers. Those are the top 2 causes of death. But even within those buckets, there are many, many, many different types of illnesses that, you know, there's hundreds of different cancers. And cancers are really complicated, and there are things that you can control and there are things that you can't control. And so when you look at risk factors are related to things like obesity and poor diet and sedentary lifestyle and so on. So you could talk about, you know, issues with obesity rates, but obesity rates are actually relatively stable in recent years. While it would be great if we had a population with lower obesity rates overall or lower obesity prevalence, because that does increase risk factors for metabolic diseases and things like that. The things that help that are not the things that he's talking about. If you actually look at trends in obesity or metabolic diseases, type 2 diabetes, and so on, the biggest predictors of that is income, access to healthcare, education level. And so you see people in red states here in the US that are less educated, have lower income, lower socioeconomic status. That actually corresponds with higher obesity rates. And a lot of that is because we don't have a national healthcare program. So we can't focus on preventive healthcare. And we don't have an exercise-friendly country, right? We don't have walkable cities. We don't have bike lanes in most cities. We don't have a lot of access to these sorts of things. And because we have a very capitalistic structure of our society, people with lower income, they often have to work multiple jobs. And so they don't have the free time to go exercise for fun after working multiple jobs. And a lot of that is because the government has refused to raise the minimum wage and pay people a livable wage here in the country. And so, yeah, there are disparities in health outcomes, but it's really along wealth lines. It's really along access to healthcare lines here, and you actually see a huge gap in health outcomes where these lower income people kind of drag down the average life expectancy here compared to other developed nations. And that's the factor. Those are the things that we could address. And he doesn't talk about anything that actually would improve that. And now he's aligning with people that want to make it harder for people to get healthcare, harder for people to afford fresh fruits and vegetables. And they actually demonize and tell people that conventional produce is filled with toxic pesticides when conventional produce is perfectly safe. It's not covered with any concerning levels of pesticides, and it's half the price and the same nutrition. And so especially people of lower income, they're now scared to eat conventional foods, and they've been told that the only thing they should do is buy organic when that data is not supported. And those are the things that he fixates on. And of course, he is undermining confidence in a lot of the health measures that have shifted the cause of mortality, right? So if people stop vaccinating, it's not going to just affect you. It's not going to affect just your family. It's going to cause the resurgence of diseases that killed people quite a bit. And yeah, maybe we'll see a shift away from chronic illness because people are going to start to die more of acute illnesses from there.
But then, don't you think that, let's say, life expectancy could go even lower?
Oh, yeah, no, it absolutely will. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to help. It's not going to improve health outcomes. But, the claims he makes about chronic disease and this chronic disease epidemic, I wouldn't term it as an epidemic in the first place, but the things that, he's omitting the context, right? Because, again, everybody's going to die of something. And so since we now have better health interventions for all of the things that would kill people at younger ages, people are now developing these diseases of aging or these diseases of chronicity because we've addressed a lot of the acute things. And, you know, he's omitting all of that to suggest that all of these environmental exposures and chemicals and food and this, that, and the other is causing this, but it's not. It's a shift in the demographics of our population, and it's not focusing on the actual tangible interventions that can address these things, like access and means to exercise and assuaging people. I mean, he could have just come out and said, hey, I made a lot of money scaring people about pesticides over the years, but in reality, conventionally grown produce is totally safe, just as nutritious, half the price. Don't be afraid of fruits and vegetables. Frozen is fine. Go eat more produce. And that would be hugely impactful. But he's not saying any of that.
Yeah. I just want to make a little, not a correction. I'm just like, I want you to specify what you meant by the obesity rates being stable. Because I have this article. Well, first of all, they're climbing from the 1975 to 2016. They're climbing pretty linearly. They're at like 36%, I think, in 2016. And then during COVID, it was my impression that they, that they jumped like 3%. I have this article from the USDA, essentially, that they went up 3%. So what do you mean by that? Is it that they plateaued, or?
Yeah, so you know, we kind of triage obesity, right? You have like obesity and you have severe obesity. So we are seeing an increase prevalence. So prevalence is different than incidence, right? And this is something that's really misunderstood by people. So when we talk about rates, we have to remember, are we talking about new diagnoses or people that are now falling into that characterization, that criteria? Or are these people that have been classified as having obesity for the last decade and they're continuing to live with obesity, right? That's prevalence. So we see some increased prevalence of obesity. And as you mentioned, it's been this kind of linear trend over the years. But you have to also look at incidence, and you're seeing kind of that middle bucket, the obese proportion. And again, the metrics to score these things, there are different ways, and some of it's based on BMI, which doesn't account for other sorts of things. But it's really been hovering kind of between this 30 to 40% range since kind of the 2010s. When you look at people who would qualify as severely obese, that's been relatively stable. Not to say that that's a good thing, right? But again, it's missing the context, and it's missing the fact that when we're looking, this graph that you're showing is share of adults, right? So this is prevalence. So this is, okay, well, people that were not adults in 1995, they're now adults in 2016. They classify as obese, but they didn't fall into this share because they weren't an adult at that age, right? So that's what I mean by prevalence versus incidence. So that's a common way to skew data and make it look bigger than it is. And it's something I see all the time with cancer data as well. Because prevalence means the number or proportion of people existing with a condition at that point in time.
Yeah. Just because I know the comments in advance, can you just like confirm that there's more people? Like if you pick a person at random, you say you have a higher chance of picking an obese person, and that's a bad thing?
Yeah. There are more people walking around. In this example, this is a BMI over 30. And we know that BMI is not, the end all be all in how we would classify someone, compared to previous decades. But again, that doesn't factor in things like expanded life expectancy, death due to other causes, so we're talking about people walking around, the country.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I think, and there's just one thing I want to go back to, because I think this episode, what I want to do different is we talk about solution as well. Otherwise, people are going to say we're just criticizing while they're trying to change something.
I got a lot of solutions.
Yeah, we'll get to the MAHA like alternative later. First, I just want to talk about the research problem. So for me, and I don't know if you agree, to fix some of the problems of research, I've been a long proponent of funding fewer studies because there's already too much information to consume, and restricting it to very high quality, high population RCTs. So they're the highest type of evidence. I don't know if that makes sense, or if you have, as a researcher, you have a. Obviously, there should be some exceptions for new findings, but like in general, the thing that gets funding should be like one big research instead of like 20 studies that can fall into the drawer effect, like we mentioned earlier. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of wasteful research. Yeah, for sure. And I think that what's going to be the most impactful is going to depend on what phenomenon we're studying, right? If we're talking about rare disease, it's really hard to have huge RCTs because the population that's affected by these things is so tiny, and that's actually why regulatory agencies have very specific criteria for rare disease research, because you don't have millions of people necessarily. But I agree that there's a lot of grants that are administered for really crappy research, and then people conduct more crappy research, and that goes viral by media clickbait, and then they get more money, and then they get funding by outside, vested, conflicts of interest, and then they do more crappy research. And so, yeah, I mean, we need to, I don't necessarily know if the solution is to restrict into just, large scale RCTs, because there's value in having diverse populations depending on like geography and the topic. But there needs to be better quality criteria for how research needs to be conducted, particularly if we're talking about human subjects research. There is value in observational studies and cohort studies and things like that, but the general public is really not aware of the limitations of these different types of studies. And so, we do need an overhaul in terms of how we fund and how we conduct research, because it does feel like there's a lot of just wasteful, frivolous studies that are not robust. They're not even constructed in a way that could answer a question, like this lead in tampons thing that was just trying to find a problem. I mean, a lot of the research nowadays that is coming out of many academic institutes just seems like they're fishing expeditions, and that's not what we really should be doing in the pursuit of good science.
Yeah. One, I think alternative to solve the, you don't want to snuff out small research is it could be just favoring more collaboration. So you do multi-center RCTs more, so you can publish the small study, but you make it part of a larger study. So every RCT becomes like a mini meta-analysis in a sense. I feel like that could work. And then there's two other solutions I have. There's one where I was asking master's students or high school students to do replication. So it's very complicated to do a study. It's way less complicated to just copy what someone has already done to make sure it replicates. So you just have like people, you show them how to do a study, and then you just can get the numbers and the teacher can supervise. I think that would be very helpful, because that would also show people the scientific process and why it's important. And it would kind of block some of the misinformation at the source, because I think it's impossible to correct the misinformation at a population level to some degree, but it is possible to prevent people. Essentially a vaccine against misinformation is teaching people scientific methods.
Yeah, I mean, critical thinking is really what it all comes down to. So if someone's trying to repeat something and they're like, I'm not getting the same answer, what am I doing wrong? Then it's a checkpoint. And then we also need to get rid of all the predatory journals, of course. All the paper mills, all the pay to publish. We need to have better processes for identifying, what gets to peer review, who's peer reviewing it, and that's a whole infrastructure issue. But if we got rid of a lot of the predatory journals, then you would have people with actual bandwidth to review good quality studies.
Yeah. And my last, I think, solution would be basically demanded that every paper is pre-trial registered, except if you find obviously if you find a new form of electricity, okay, we'll allow it. But just in general, being way more demanding, unless you have something spectacular, you pre-trial register. Can you explain what it is for people that are not aware at home and why it could be important?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So and you've actually hit that's a good point, is that they've there are data that demonstrate that pretrial registration actually improves the robustness of the quality of data. So pretrial registration is basically before you conduct a research trial or a scientific study, you document what you're going to do. You're saying, I'm conducting this study. This is my research design. This is my objective. These are my hypotheses. This is the method, and this is how I'm going to analyze the data. And so what it does is it improves the transparency of what you're actually going to be doing. And it eliminates your ability to fudge the data after the fact, to p-hack, or to change how you present the data, or manipulate the axes, or change any sort of visualization, because you've said, in order to assess whether or not X, Y, or Z has an impact on condition B, this is what I need to do. This is my sample size. These are my cohorts. This is my demographic, and so on and so forth. And so by having this pretrial registration, it eliminates a lot of these ways that you can manipulate or introduce bias in your data. And so you have a hypothesis. You either are going to reject it or you're going to accept it. And you can't say, hey, we didn't find anything, but this is our hypothesis because we saw this little tiny shift in these data. And even though it has a standard deviation of 50%, it's totally fine. And so this gives people a peek behind the curtain, particularly peer reviewers and others in the scientific community, to know, okay, well, is this study conducted with good scientific method or not, before you even start the study. And so I think I would love to see that, because I also think that it would reduce the amount of frivolous crap studies, because it takes time to actually think about these things before you throw spaghetti at the wall. And so it would eliminate a lot of the sloppy research that we see, particularly with like wellness industry stuff and so on.
I'm just gonna simplify it. Sorry, Diego.
In that sense, sorry.
I'm just gonna specify, just because it can be murky for people that don't like working stats. The example I like to use is if you have a bunch of dye and you pretend you could do telekinesis. If I just throw like 7 dyes and I go like, one's going to land on 6. That's not very convincing. But if you do a paper, you can go back and say, yeah, I wanted the blue dice to be the one that fell on 6. If you do pretrial registration, you can avoid doing that, like the going back and forth, because you're going to have a mention that you change your target outcome. So it would need to say in advance, I want the blue dice specifically to fall on 6, not the other ones. But if you don't do that, you can say, yeah, I wanted the blue dice to do that from the beginning. So it eliminates that way out to essentially, like you said, do research with spaghetti on the wall. Go ahead, Diego.
Yeah, so I was thinking about point number 2 when it comes to replication projects. And during my time with the Skeptical Physio account, I have proposed many replication projects for different subjects and, of course, at different educational levels. So I'm talking about masters and PhDs too. And I think that the most common response that I have always obtained is in the lines of, if it's not new, it won't get published. And I have remembered about a scientist, I don't remember his name, but he said something like, I conduct 2 kinds of research. The first one is the one that I publish, and the second one is the one that is going to push science forward. And I think that in that sense, it's sad, but I think that we all can agree that because there are a lot of PhDs in so many different fields and they need to publish papers, we agree that most of those papers probably are not going to push science forward, and they are not selfish, but a lesser bad that you need to promote because you need to obtain your PhD.
Yeah.
So I think that we are now in a really uncomfortable situation because we have the open access movement, we have the predatory publishers, we have a lot of PhDs that are trying to obtain, let's say, a lecturer position at a local university or something, and funds to keep their research. So I don't know, but it seems that the water is murky, and there are many solutions that are being proposed, especially from the open science framework model, for example, but it seems that adoption is not happening, unfortunately.
Can I go? I just want to go back to the pretrial registration. So Andrea said there was evidence showing it was useful. It does. There's a really good research. Agnes Deschat is a really good researcher in terms of like how we can spot bad studies and bad things, like things to do with like, I'd say metastats, like looking at the effect size and stuff like that as a whole. And she has a paper from 2016 named Association Between Trial Registration and Treatment Effect Estimates, a meta-epidemiological study. Essentially what it shows is that the lack of pretrial registration may be associated with larger treatment effect estimates. So hang on if I'm reading this. Trials unregistered or registered after the primary completion date tended to show larger treatment effect estimates than those registered before this date. Combined ROR of 0.84 based on 43 contributing meta-analyses. Andrea, can you help me here? Oh, is she gone?
No,
Sorry,
she's
my-
fine.
Andrea, can you help me with what the ROR is in this sense? I'm not too sure.
Oh,
Rate of return, I guess. Is that...
no. Hang on, sorry. Something is popping up. I don't know why my computer literally just shut off for no reason.
It's a ratio of
yes.
odds ratio. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so you got a couple of things, a couple of like abbreviations. It could be your risk of reporting bias. So that's like the odds of one outcome versus the odds of the same outcome in a different group. And so if you have an ROR of 1, there's no reporting bias. But in this one, yeah, so you're looking at an odds ratio. So you're looking at, an impact.
16% difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so there's data. You were correct. All right, so now we'll get into specific. I think we've nerded out quite a bit. So I guess we'll go
Yes.
rapid fire and talk about specific points that RFK did. And we'll do it in the fashion that I talked about, where I'll basically present the skeptical, like, I don't trust science kind of point of view, and you'll help me kind of debunk it if necessary, or you'll tell me I'm right if that's right. So we'll start with the vaccines one, because I think that's the one that has the biggest impact. First of all, before we start, I think we should listen to RFK because everyone keeps telling me he's not actually anti-vax. And I have an extract, you'll see. If you're looking at the video instead of listening to it, you'll see how it's pretty contradictory. So
what I meant, which was a bad
hang on, this is not it.
as-
This one.
You've said previously that no vaccine is safe or effective, which is...
I've never said that.
You did say that in a podcast interview
No,
in
I've
July.
never said that.
You did say that. There are quotes, and that
You
recording is
are
there.
wrong, and you're making something up.
You have gained notoriety for your skepticism about vaccines. And over the summer in an interview, you said, quote, there's no vaccine that is, safe and effective. Do you still believe that?
These are a
I
month
never
apart.
said that.
So stop me. We have the clip. Please play the clip.
Play the whole clip.
You've talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer. And you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
So you did say it. Do you still believe it?
Well, here's what I.
Yeah. So he's not anti-vaccine. He's just anti-all vaccines. There's an important nuance, Andrea. I don't think you understand how
No,
complex
yeah.
this man is.
Definitely. Yeah. There's a distinction. Yeah.
So I think you should talk about. So what I've heard is that before vaccines were a thing, infant mortality were about 40% higher. So my point of view is that unless you think babies dying is a good thing, maybe if vaccines are a good idea. Do you have anything to?
Yeah,
do you
no,
agree?
I mean, I think that's the nail on the head. The reason that families don't need to have, 8, 10, 12 children is because the likelihood that all of them will survive is near 100 these days. So, and that's because of vaccines, and children are at particularly high risk for infectious diseases, particularly those that are transmitted person to person, because their immune system is not fully matured. And so they can't fend them off as well as an adult with a more mature immune system. And that's why we vaccinate children at the age we do when they're at highest risk and most likely to be exposed to these things that can kill them. And we have 300 years of data demonstrating the benefit of various vaccines, starting from really rudimentary smallpox inoculation using variolation that dropped smallpox mortality from over 30% to less than 3% because of inoculation and immunization. So yeah, I mean, the data are unequivocal. Vaccines do not cause autism. The data are also unequivocal on that. That was a fully fraudulent study by Andrew Wakefield, who RFK Jr. and their buddies. He made a lot of money spreading those lies. His data were fabricated. There have been decades upon decades of data spanning millions of children that have demonstrated that the biggest predictor of autism is having a direct family member also with autism. There is a strong genetic linkage. It's not vaccines. Vaccine ingredients are extensively studied, overwhelmingly safe. They're not causing turbo cancer. They're not causing any of these things. They are protecting us against deadly and debilitating disease, and RFK Jr.'s actions have led to the deaths of children. So I guess if that is your angle of making people healthy, that's one way to frame it.
Yeah, I'm just going to pull up the data just because we like to be thorough to set an example for what we expect from, I'll say, the other side. So Luke Taylor, meta-analysis from 2014. Vaccines are not associated with autism, an evidence-based meta-analysis of case control and cohort study. The cohort data revealed no relationship between vaccination and autism, an OR of 0.99 to 1.06. 0.99. So arguably you could say vaccines actually reduce autism by 1%. Technically, it's not good science because it overlaps with zero, but whatever. Nor was there a relationship between autism and MMR vaccines or thimerosal or mercury. So yeah, that's also a big battle horse of, RFK. We don't mention it in the doc a lot, but essentially I think he's worried about a mercury salt, which isn't the same as mercury at all.
Yeah.
And it's in very, very small quantities compared to like what we are exposed to with like fish or something.
Well, yeah. So I've written a bunch of newsletters, and I'll send those to you because all the studies that you're showing and more are linked, including, a study in 1999, one in 2002, one in 2019, one in 2014, decades upon decades. So he likes to vilify a compound called thimerosal, which is a version of a type of mercury compound called ethyl mercury. And so when we talk about chemicals, everything is a chemical, but chemicals have different chemical structures. And just because a molecule contains something doesn't mean that it has the same properties, right? So when I talk about thimerosal, I like to use the analogy of table salt. So table salt, people know what it is, right? Most people don't know that it's an ionic compound, meaning it has positive ions and negative ions, and you slap them together and they make this crystalline solid. And the ionic compound is called sodium chloride. That's what we use as table salt. And so you have sodium ions and you have chlorine ions. Now, elemental sodium is a metal at room temperature, and it explodes if you put it in water. Elemental chlorine is a gas at room temperature, and it is incredibly toxic with low inhalation exposure. But if you slap those two elements together, you make this table salt, which helps you with flavoring food, and sodium and chlorine ions are essential for physiological processes. So this kind of the sum are not, the equal to the parts, right? And so thimerosal is demonized because people don't understand the difference between ethyl mercury, methyl mercury, and elemental mercury. Elemental mercury is a liquid metal, and it's very different from ethyl mercury, which is an ion that has a mercury ion attached to an ethyl group, which is a carbon hydrogen chunk. Methyl mercury is a different structure, and while they look kind of similar, they are very, very different. Those different groups are very, very different. So we can be poisoned by mercury, but mercury poisoning is typically with exposure to elemental mercury, which is liquid mercury, or gaseous elemental mercury, so mercury gas vapor. or through methylmercury exposure. So methylmercury is the one that we hear about with accumulating in fish and in the soil.
Yep.
And this one does not, we don't excrete it rapidly. Methylmercury is created by bacterial reactions. It's also generated through volcanic eruptions, fossil fuel burning, and industrial processes, and it's found everywhere. But methylmercury bioaccumulates and it's not rapidly metabolized, so it can persist in your body for about 60 days. And so if you have repeat exposures of it at certain doses, it can be harmful. But that's not what thimerosal is. Thimerosal is ethyl mercury, and that difference is very important. So thimerosal is a salt of ethyl mercury. It's a thiosalicylate salt. So basically, it's that ethyl mercury, and then you attach a negative ion to it to make thimerosal. And we use it in very small quantities, and we've used it for 100 years because it inhibits contamination. And it's used in multi-dose vaccine vials. So when you're going in and you're dipping a needle and you're removing vaccine dose, you're not going to contaminate by dipping in, right? We use it in a vaccine vial at tiny quantities, right? We're talking micrograms per vaccine dose.
Yeah.
Now, the exposure levels were actually set based on, methylmercury history, because we had a lot of data about methylmercury because it's everywhere, right? And so FDA had kind of set the safety guidance based on the more toxic methylmercury, and then people got confused, and this led to a lot of misinformation. But basically, people conflated thimerosal and ethyl mercury with the more toxic methylmercury, and as a result, we actually removed thimerosal from pretty much all vaccines in the US except for select multi-dose flu vaccine vials, which accounts for less than 7% of flu vaccines that are administered in the US. So not only is thimerosal not harmful and it's not the bad mercury, vaccines don't have it anymore either. So, and that was, again, because of misinformation, but.
Yeah. Okay. Diego, I sent a question in the chat. Yeah, that really fits with what I saw. But again, I'm not an expert, but I'll play a little video. Then Diego has a question. But what I find really interesting is that he's saying he's an anti-vax, but he's just denying the data. So like saying you're just pro-safe vaccines when there's plenty of evidence of safety and efficacy of vaccines is a bit weird. And his argument after that, in that interview, he says like, I don't think you could say there's safe, what's it called? Like medication for cancer. What's like, they're going to die otherwise. Yeah. So the argument that like, any risk is like not worth the risk. It's like, what's risky is letting people die of like extremely contagious diseases.
Yeah.
And I guess we'll skip to it. Hang on. I did a little preparation because I know a lot of people that are, there's a lot of data on this. A lot of people that are vaccine hesitant or they're moved more by like simple images. They did a study where they essentially asked like a doctor to, I think it was like they told him to show them images of like babies that suffered like not being vaccinated, and that was more efficient than talking about the evidence. So this is the black line is when the vaccine is introduced. This is a compilation for the Vaccine Journal. Use the CDC data. So you got measles, you get all this. The bigger, this is a heat map. So the bigger the map is, the more cases there are. And when the vaccine is introduced, it gets all blue because there is essentially no cases after. This is for polio. Same trend. Like there's for like decades, there's the infection is super high, and then it's climbing, then the vaccine comes, boom, it disappeared. Same thing for mumps. Same thing for hepatitis A. Same things for measles. I feel like, there's a pretty clear, hang on. I'm going to share this tab instead. We see it here. We see it here. And yeah, it's pretty hard not to see like a very clear pattern. I don't think it takes like a PhD in stats to notice that when a vaccine is introduced systematically, the disease has a sneaky tendency to disappear. And this is why I made a little meme about it. So people will follow me. You're getting a preview. So it's like conspiracy theorists I simply have a pattern recognizing brain when people tell them they're conspiracy theorists. And then it's like conspiracy theorists, when you explain diseases and mortality, mysteriously start dropping whenever vaccines are introduced. And they're just like, oh, it must have been the wind. It's just like such a common tendency. It's only when it's like the Jews that you seem to be good at noticing patterns. It's pretty interesting. Yeah. No offense. I'm sure there's conspiracy theorists that are not anti-Semitic. It's just my venture into conspiracy theorists. It's if you dig enough, it's always the Jews for some reason. Yeah, I think Diego has a question.
Okay, so it seems that the United States National Immunization Schedule includes twice as many vaccines as any other jurisdiction. So, of course, if we compare how many vaccines are, let's say, American kids receiving compared to, let's say, Canada, and I'm sure that Alexis can give us the exact number, but of course, Americans being a bit conspirationist, don't you think that it could give them a place to say, okay, but why are we receiving, or why are we forced to have so many vaccines when other countries are just, let's say, having 10 instead of 20 or 30? Maybe it's a big pharma thing, or maybe it's because logical, scientific-based reasons.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will start by saying a lot of people are misled about this. So specifically, if we're talking about like the pediatric vaccine schedules between something like the US and Canada, they're actually almost the same. And so if you look at what's recommended for pediatric patients, you're going to have a lot of the usual suspects. So you have DTaP, which is diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. You have polio. You have Haemophilus influenza B, or the Hib vaccine. You have hepatitis B. You have MMR, which is measles, mumps, rubella. You have varicella, which is chickenpox. You have the human papillomavirus, the HPV vaccine. You have the hepatitis A vaccine. You have the annual flu shot, which is also recommended. You also have the pneumococcal vaccine, which is pneumococcal pneumonia. It's caused by a bacteria. You also have the meningococcal vaccine, meningitis. So that is meningitis caused by Neisseria meningitidis bacteria. There's 4 strains. And those are actually the same across Canada and the US as examples. You have a couple of differences. So, for example, in the US, we recommend rotavirus vaccine for all kids, whereas in Canada, they have a broad recommendation for rotavirus, but sometimes it may be excluded if there haven't been cases of rotavirus in a given province in Canada, because rotavirus is a gastrointestinal disease that's spread by fecal oral close contact spread from people that are shedding the virus. And then Canada recommends hepatitis A vaccine. So hepatitis A is a virus that is transmitted by contaminated food and water, person to person, but also because of poor hygiene practices. So that is routine in the US for everyone, or all kids. Canada, it's again based on regional prevalence or risk assessments. And then one difference is that Canada administers the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, and we don't administer that in the US. So there actually isn't a lot of difference in developed nations. And the other thing that we hear is, oh, well, there's so many more vaccines now. And it's like, yeah, because science has allowed us to now create vaccines to protect against things that we couldn't previously protect against, right? I didn't get the chickenpox vaccine. I got chickenpox. And that means that now that virus lives in my body, and I've already gotten shingles because of it. If they had the chickenpox vaccine when I was a kid, I would have happily gotten that. I was also the cusp group of when the human papillomavirus vaccine got approved. And so I had already been older than the optimal time before you're ever potentially exposed to human papillomaviruses, but I still retroactively got the vaccine because that vaccine prevents cancers. And so, there's this weird disconnect where like, well, there's more vaccines than when I was a kid. And you should be applauding that. You should be applauding the fact that we can now protect against more things that kill people and cause disease, not suggesting it's some plot to make people more sick, because it's actually doing the opposite. The HPV vaccine has eliminated cancer in populations that have had widespread adoption of that vaccine. We've seen a dramatic decline in HPV associated cancers, including cervical cancer, throat cancer, and anal cancer because of that vaccine. And it's fantastic that we have it, and we should continue to develop vaccines for diseases that are deadly and debilitating. And I hope that in another 3 decades we have more vaccines to add to the list.
Yeah, I think, but I'd say if a conspiracy heard this, he'd check if your name is not Lovestein or used to be Loveberg or something. But yeah, I agree 100%. I think Diego has to log off because it's extremely late. I'll keep going.
Yeah, so here's midnight, so I will
That's
need to
fine.
leave.
It's
but
almost my
before that-
bedtime anyway. I'm still like messing. I've had 2 time changes and daylight savings, and so
Yeah, so
I'll keep going.
Before leaving, I would like to say that smallpox is the only disease that we have been able to eradicate from the earth.
Yeah.
And that has been due to Edward Jenner. I think that he was the first that
I mean, he made the safer, the modern, more modern version of the smallpox vaccine. But it even started, thousands of years ago with very primitive versions of inoculation using the actual smallpox virus. But yeah,
I'll talk about it. I have a good story about this. Yeah.
So it seems that smallpox in its last century of existence killed like 500 million people, and it was eradicated. I think that it was in the 80s due to what we call the Soviet Union now, the Soviet Union, because they realized that there were a lot of their people dying due to that, and there was a vaccine at the time, so why not to inoculate that? And another curiosity about the smallpox, and that's from my Spanish heritage, is that, of course, when Spain had all those colonies, if you want to call them that, in South America, they of course brought the smallpox there. They weren't aware of that, but they did it. So we had a nurse. Now we have a famous hospital here in Madrid called Isabel Zendal. That's her name, and she realized that there was a need to have a big vaccination campaign, but they didn't know how to transport the vaccine from Spain, from Europe, if you want to South America. So I think that what they did was they inoculate the virus to kids, so they could then, when they arrive there in South America, extract, let's say, the vaccine. So I think that one of the sad things about vaccines is that we have lost the respect for them, because we give them for granted, and we don't realize that if let's say COVID was or had the mortality rate that smallpox had, the earth would be depleted right now. Will be like less than 10%. I think that smallpox have a mortality rate of 30% or so.
Yeah.
So, and imagine, for example, Ebola or something like that. Like, we have a lot to thank for, in that sense, for vaccines, but also for big pharma, if you want to, because it always seems that they are the bad guys, and even when there are, of course, some things that we can criticize, they are doing a great job, at least in this kind of things.
Yeah.
So
it's their vaccines are a victim of their own success, right? It's the survivorship bias. Most people don't personally know someone that had smallpox or paralytic polio, although there have been some cases of paralytic polio recently because people are not vaccinating anymore, and
exactly.
it's a shame that they're taking it for granted and they're being very cavalier, because I mean, microorganisms will continue to evolve whether we do anything to try to stop them and compete with them or not, and rejecting these things that save lives is only going to harm ourselves.
Agreed.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, guys, I'm leaving. Thank you, Andrea, for being a guest. It has been a great chat, and I'm sure that the remainder of the podcast is going to be great. I will listen to it tomorrow, or, well, yes, I think that When will this be posted, Alexis? Do you
So
know?
I'll try to post it next week because this is like timely and it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Okay.
Where can people find you,
So-
Diego?
Yeah, they can find me at Skeptical Physio, and if you are on X or Twitter, as it was known before, Physio Skeptical. So I hope you will have a great time, guys, and see you tomorrow, next week, in 2 weeks, next month.
All right. Buenas
Whenever.
noches, muchacho.
Buenas noches, chicos. Ciao, ciao.
Buenas noches. All right. Bye-bye. Yeah, so I was going to say a very interesting story about this is that if we look at, you talked about how smallpox was done with like the lesser strains of the virus. A big story a lot of people don't know is they say like forcing people to get vaccines is very anti-American. But if you look at the history of America, that's how one of the main ways they beat the English is that they survived smallpox better because George Washington would force these extremely experimental, dangerous vaccines on people. It was literally like, oh, he had smallpox and he survived. You go and rub your like his pus or whatever it's called, like the what is it called, like the little bubonic
it's a pustule. Yeah, so they would take the rudimentary. It's called variolation. They would take the pus, the liquid fluid within inside the vesicle of a smallpox vesicle, and that contained tons and tons of virus, and they would cut
rub
or
that on
scrape.
a wound.
Yep. And that would cause a milder version of smallpox. And if when the person survived, they would be immune. And Washington mandated this for all incoming troops through Philadelphia port during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah. So that's literally how arguably America was founded by the father of America.
Yeah.
So you could argue there's nothing more American than taking your shots. It's like the most patriotic thing you can do.
Yeah, I wrote a piece on 4th of July to underscore that because it's people don't know their history, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting that America is this idea of masculinity has been maybe I'm not going to go into masculinity, but whatever. The idea of like being a patriot has been so warped that like supporting the army that's waging war against like random countries that have done nothing wrong a lot of times. Let's say like the Vietnam War. I'm not saying they did nothing wrong, but the US has nothing to do there. That's considered patriotic. But doing something that can prevent kids from dying, and that's literally just a fucking injection. That's like the end of the world. That's communism. That's nonsense, I think.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
And also the Supreme Court in the early 1900s upheld that vaccine mandates for the good of the public superseded one person's personal belief because of the societal benefit. So it actually has been deemed constitutional to implement vaccine mandates.
Yeah, it's a good point. Hey guys, thanks for listening all the way to the end. Andrea and I will be back for part 2. If you like this episode, make sure to leave us a 5-star review or a like. And in part 2, Andrea and I will finish addressing the points levied by the MAHA movement, as well as answering follower questions. It's a great discussion. Have a good one. Peace.